We are so incredibly excited to be working with STEM Wine Bar. They offer Portland's widest wine selection with 150 wines by the glass, 18 curated flights, custom private wine tastings, and free delivery. STEM Wine Bar is open daily and donating all profits of BLM Pinot Noir made by Oregon's first Black female winery owner and winemaker. Learn more at stemwinebarpdx.com.
Hello, I'm editor Keelan King, and welcome to The Foretop, a roundtable discussion of the hot button topics in food and beverage featuring leaders, thinkers, and innovators. And now, here's your host, Katherine Cole.
Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Katherine Cole. We are calling this episode Harvest 2020, a year like no other. We're going to discuss why this was the most dangerous harvest season in memory, the importance of our immigrant and migrant workforce, and some rays of hope for positive change as we look ahead to the future. Our panelists today are Vanessa García Polenco, a researcher, writer, and activist focusing on food, agriculture, and sustainability. Welcome, Vanessa.
Hello.
And Reyna Lopez, Executive Director at PCUN, Oregon's Farm Worker Union. Hi, Reyna.
Hey, everybody.
And Somini Sengupta, author and international climate reporter for the New York Times. Thank you so much for joining us, Somini. I know you're on the East Coast and it's very late there.
Nice to be with you.
Well, thanks, everyone. Let's start off this episode with a discussion of why 2020 was the most dangerous harvest season in recent history. It has been an incredibly challenging year for all of us, but no group of people has been put at greater risk this fall than agricultural workers. In August, the Midwest was hit by a derecho or superstorm, and now as we record this, the West continues to battle deadly wildfires. And then there's COVID-19. Somini Sengupta, your August 25th piece in the New York Times, which we will post in our social media feed, summed up the situation for laborers working harvest, and it was quite bleak. Can you tell us about some of the farm workers you met and the health threats that they were facing?
Yeah, thanks. I drove through the Central Valley of California this summer during a really calamitous wave of heat, fire, and surging coronavirus infections. And I wanted to see what was happening in my home state. California is where I'm from. I wanted to see what was happening during this period through the eyes of the people who are worst affected, farm workers. Most of them were immigrants from Mexico. Most of them earned minimum wage, which is around $13 an hour in California. Most of them lacked health insurance, and they were subject to chronic pollution. So even when there weren't fires and wildfire smoke, they were living amid chronic air pollution. And the week I was there, the fires were just really beginning to sweep through the state. And I remember meeting a woman named Leonor Hernandez near the town of Lodi, California. She was a mother of three. She had been working in the fields for many years. And on the day that I went to see her, she was working in a cherry orchard. She was dressed as usual in her full-sleeved shirt, her hat, bandana covering most of her face. She had a water bottle stuffed in her pocket, and she was going up and down the cherry orchard. The harvest was over. There were no more fruits on the trees, but it was her job to scoop up all the stray branches that had been hacked off after the harvest and put them inside a bin. And why was she doing this when it was almost 100 degrees by 12 noon? Well, she was doing it. It was her job because the orchard had to be cleared for the next spraying of pesticides. Whether it was 100 degrees or not, whether there was wildfire smoke in the air or not, this is what she had to do. And like her, I met many, many agricultural workers, men and women, who had really not a whole lot of choice but to be outdoors working, um, even when the local air pollution control board was telling everybody, stay indoors, don't come outside. Well, that really wasn't a choice. If they didn't come outdoors, if they weren't working outdoors, agricultural workers were not getting paid.
Mm. And they're doing this work so that pesticides can be sprayed, which makes their working conditions even more dangerous.
That is, pesticide spraying is one of the sources of chronic air pollution in the area. There's also just the diesel fumes from trucks going up and down the highways. There's a lot of dust that comes from just the dust that settles, on the leaves of the trees. And because the Central Valley of California is really like a big, vast pasta bowl, the pollution from Southern California, the wildfire smoke from Southern California and Northern California just gets stuck in the valley.
Mm.
So year round, residents of the Central Valley face extremely unhealthy air quality. And of course, this year, when the fires have just been off the charts, it has been a particularly hazardous year.
Mm. And Somini, did you see people wearing masks? I mean, in your article, you spoke about temperatures above 100 degrees.
Yes, I mean, this was a very, very intense period of heat. When I was there in August, they were going through a really intense heat wave, and that, of course, is one of the signals of climate change being felt in places like the U.S. West. Summer days are hotter than they were a century ago in the already very, very hot Central Valley of California. And even worse, the nights when the body has a chance to cool down, well, the nights are warming even faster than the days.
Mm.
Heat waves are more frequent than they were before. And as you well know, across California and Oregon, fires have burned millions of acres this year. And where you are in Oregon, of course, the wildfire season has been the worst on record. Now, I bring this up just to drive home that, climate change and the impacts of climate change are exacerbating what are already hazardous work conditions for agricultural workers. And in many parts of the United States, occupational health laws really have not kept pace with that. California is one of two states, along with Washington, that has occupational health laws for what to do in extreme heat, but those are, still really just how to put it. I mean, they're very basic protections. Employers must provide shade. Usually that means a bench with a canopy. Employers must provide drinking water. Many labor contractors do stop work. I've seen this when it gets too hot, but the law doesn't really require. There isn't really a threshold temperature when the law says, okay, you've got to stop working. And finally, I'll just add that this goes to a much, much deeper problem. Even if there was a threshold temperature, enshrined in the law that said, okay, workers have to get off the field at when the temperature reaches a particular level when it's unhealthy. Well, when you stop working, hourly wage earners don't get paid.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not exactly the best option for many of the agricultural workers I spoke to.
Mm-hmm. And, there are long-term health effects as well. In your article, you mentioned that kidney functions decline with prolonged dehydration among many agricultural workers. There are all these ever long-lasting effects that we don't even think about. And I imagine most of these folks don't have air conditioning and are living in pretty cramped quarters as well, which brings up the COVID threat. It's just one thing after another. It's a lot. Vanessa, I was actually going to ask you, you created a database of articles about COVID-19 and the food system, which we will post on our social media feed. And I'm just curious what you've learned from compiling this work.
Yeah, sure. I would say compiling those articles was like my coping mechanism during the beginning of the pandemic. Because it was like there was so much information coming and going, and I can see a lot of people not getting the right information. But it was really, I remember like the first time I saw a farm worker related article. It was like early April, and most of the other articles were like about many other things. And I just remember being like, oh, wow, like it took us like a month to realize that we were not thinking about our food
Mm-hmm.
supply or thinking our food supply in a different way. And I think through the process of collecting those articles and sharing them, it was amazing. We had like even like 300 people visiting the site at every given minute, just looking for information, looking to learn more about how the pandemic was affecting, is still affecting the food system. And what I mostly remember is like how shocking it was that most people were not thinking about like agricultural workforce and like the food supply chain. Like most of the connections that I saw people making were like, oh, there's no X, Y, and Z at the
Mm-hmm.
store. And people were not thinking it's because some farms had to shut down for like a few days or a few plants had to shut down because we were not really understanding or we were not taking the right precautions or many other reasons why the food supply changed during those first weeks. And even today, the food supply chain is still like adapting and still pivoting to trying to cope with a new way we're doing food consumption
Mm-hmm.
right now. So I think I will say that was definitely, I think that was the biggest lesson that I saw in the public sphere. Like a lot of people had never thought really where their food comes from and making those connections about food, what we culturally call food literacy, like actually knowing like how much your food travels, food miles, or actually knowing that food doesn't only come from the supermarket, that is a complicated food supply chain distribution that starts even beyond the farm
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. And who are the people involved, like farm workers, distribution centers, and so many
Yeah.
others.
Reyna, what have you been seeing here in Oregon? Are farm workers aware that they've been declared to be essential workers? They must be. And how do they feel about working in these incredibly dangerous conditions?
Well, thank you so much for the question. And I feel like this term has really taken a new meaning for many people, especially for the community that PECUN serves. PECUN stands for the Pineros y Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste, and today we have about 6,000 members based mainly in the Mid-Willamette Valley, the heart of the agricultural district in Marion County specifically. And for me, the way that I'm really very connected to this is that I myself am a daughter of farm workers who followed the migration north to really find a better life. And even as a child, going out and picking blueberries, marionberries, cherries, even worms at one point. We never saw anything like this in the past. It's really been the perfect storm with what we're seeing with COVID, the pandemic, and also with the wildfires. And as you said, farm workers are deemed essential. But what I like to remind people is that we were essential before the pandemic and we're going to be essential after the pandemic and should be treated as essential. I think that time and time again, we're hearing testimonies of agricultural workers who frankly feel forgotten. They feel essential yet disposable. And why? Because today in Oregon, we're seeing that about 50% of the workplace outbreaks are affecting our essential food supply chain workers, that 40% of COVID cases today are in Oregon are Latinx, despite us being only 12 to 13% of the population, and that Marion County, where we're located, we have some of the top cases of COVID. And not only that, but I think that one thing that people don't realize is that the gaps that we already had, they just got magnified, right? We have seen people trying to take their paid leave. They don't have paid medical leave. So if somebody needs to quarantine for COVID, people are showing up to work, right? Because they can't afford to miss a day. And then we see these outbreaks. I think that that's one of the reasons that we need to really look in the mirror and say, how can we get people the ability to go take 2 weeks without worrying about their job not being here when they come back? I think that also it's not a secret that the backbone of our agricultural economy is undocumented workers, people who came like my family without papeles, without papers, to be able to make sure that Americans have food on their tables. And that today this is still one of the most dangerous jobs, has some of the highest fatality rates on the job. And what we're working in today is in some dangerous conditions without that being reflected in pay. Another place that I think is something that we should really be paying close attention to is the labor housing. We know that with dozens of workers at times sharing, dorm style housing, or a lot of folks just sharing a living space, that makes social distancing impossible and the conditions even more deadly. And even from the beginning, this hit really close to home for me. One of my very dear friends, her father had passed away from COVID-19, and her father also works in the same processing plant as my own mother. So I mean, these are things that are hitting close to home, in addition to where the perfect storm comes in, which is the wildfires in the Northwest. We started getting a lot of calls in mid-September when we were starting to get level 1, level 2, level 3 evacuation orders. And one thing that people didn't really realize is that agricultural workers made up a significant portion of the resident population in the counties that were most affected by the wildfires, and then the hazardous smoke that and air conditions that came with that. Right now, the West Coast is in a state of emergency, but specifically the places that we were responding to were Marion County, Clackamas County, and Jackson County. And it was important for us to ensure that people understood that there were still thousands of outdoor farm workers that were out there breathing high density smoke during the unprecedented effects of the wildfires. And we were seeing that many people, despite the level 1s and the level 2 evacuation orders, that people were just kind of confused about what the instructions were, and they were like, well, we're out here, we have to we have to be. And it was really a time when we had to go into quick response and make sure that people had N95 masks. We had to make sure that people were getting the information in language, because let's not forget that it's not just Spanish speaking folks that are in our agricultural worker community, but also this is a community that also speaks indigenous languages of Latin America. So even some of the information that was in Spanish, some people couldn't understand it because people also speak Mam, or they speak Tarasco or Zapoteco or Mixteco, which are some of the top spoken indigenous languages of our agricultural community in Oregon today. So lots of different challenges, but one thing that I would say was really heartening was to just see the outpour of support from community, and community really having to step up and do that collective care to make sure that we were looking out for each other in lieu of not having the systems and the government support in place to make sure communities were being served in the best way possible and in the quickest way possible during an emergency like that.
Well, I want to keep talking, but we have to take a quick sponsor break, and we will be back in the conversation in a minute here. Hey, listeners, we are pleased to be sponsored this month by a wine brand called Chemistry. So right now, I am actually going to take a taste of the 2019 Chemistry Willamette Valley Pinot Gris. And it is delicious. 2019 was my kind of vintage in Oregon. It was nice and cool, which makes for the sorts of wines I really enjoy, which are light-bodied with bright acidity. And at just 12.5% alcohol by volume, this is a wine you can sip all evening, and it's priced at just $14, so it's super affordable. So you can feel good about your purchase as well, because Chemistry is a collaboration between 2 Oregon wineries, Stoller and Chehalem, which are both certified B corporations. That means they've met the highest standard of verified social and environmental performance, public transparency, and legal accountability. Stoller and Chehalem created chemistry wines for your everyday enjoyment, and I really think you will all enjoy this Pinot Gris as much as I am, so check it out. And now, back to the show. Okay, now it's time for our next topic. Kind of picking up where we left off. This topic is immigrants. They get the job done. Reyna Lopez, when we talk about farm labor issues, as you were just saying, we're essentially talking about immigrant and migrant workers. According to the USDA, at least 75% of US agricultural workforce is foreign born, and at least 50% lack legal documentation. Just tell us about the immigrant and migrant workforce in fall 2020. What should those of us who love food and beverage and follow these issues know about this group of people right now in this most dangerous harvest season? And you talked a bit about the language barriers, that it's not just Spanish, there are other languages. What are some other barriers that they're facing due to their status?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And for me, really, my specialty is Oregon. Just in Oregon today, we have about 87,000 agricultural workers. Our population doesn't have as many H-2A workers. I would say that there's probably about 4,000 H-2A workers in Oregon. And really, the rest of our workforce in Oregon is about half seasonal and half migrant. So folks coming up from California too, and from Washington to help us get the work done here in Oregon. And basically, the a big, big chunk of our community doesn't have documentation status. Most of the community is from Mexico, or Guatemala is also a place that has a representation here in Oregon. And some of the biggest issues that I think have always been there, but I want to really highlight them now because they have been definitely magnified since the pandemic has started. But I think even just the lack of documentation, people forget that in these times we depend on things like a federal stimulus or unemployment insurance when folks are being laid off during or furloughed during the COVID-19 pandemic, or when you can't go to work because it's just too smoky outside, right? And unfortunately, a lot of our community is falling through the cracks of unemployment insurance. They are not going to be getting they didn't get a federal stimulus check, and if there's another package, they're going to fall through the cracks there. I would say that also indigenous languages is something that is very important for people to understand, that this is an essential and key part when we're doing outreach to our communities. Some people speak solely indigenous languages, and I mentioned a few of them a little bit before we went to the break, but even with our outreach team, we have to make sure that our outreach workers speak Mixteco Bajo or Mixteco Alto Mam to make sure that we can communicate with community. I would also say that another thing that is has been an ongoing issue, issues of wage theft have been ongoing, issues of sexual violence in the fields have been ongoing.
Can I stop you there? What is wage theft for our listeners?
Wage theft is, well, let me give you an example. I think that one of the best example would be, we have a farm worker who maybe worked 10 hours in the day, and then when they got their payment for work, they only got paid for 7 hours in that day.
Mm.
And if we're not tracking those things, if we're not keeping a close eye on them, that would be something that would be considered wage theft. So when somebody comes to our worker center and they say, hey, I was shorted here, or maybe I just never received payment for my work and the harvest is almost over, those would be issues of wage theft that are coming up with our agricultural community. In addition to issues of just really unfair labor housing conditions, sometimes conditions where there's no water access in the fields. These are all issues that have been a continuous problem that we're continuing to deal with, and now the burden just gets a little heavier, especially considering what the repercussions of the pandemic and the wildfires have been on agricultural communities all across the West Coast.
Catherine, when Reyna was talking, I was really reminded of a young woman I met in the Central Valley named Briseida Flores, and she decided to go to work with her mother in the fields after her dad was laid off during the pandemic. And I met her one morning when she was working in the cornfield, and she had started work that day at 4:30 in the morning. And when they first showed up at work, because it was a little cooler, and when they first showed up at work, sky was dark. She could see smoke and some fires in the distance, but at least, it was cool enough for her to be working in the fields. By 10:30 in the morning, she said it was so unbearably hot. They just couldn't go into the cornfields anymore. And the thing that really stayed with me when I met Briseida was she wasn't harvesting corn for human consumption. She wasn't even harvesting corn for animal consumption. She wasn't harvesting corn even for ethanol production. She was harvesting the little orange and yellow colored ears used to decorate the Thanksgiving table. And for this, she was waking up at 4:30 in the morning, or showing up at work rather at 4:30 in the morning, and working in the fields during these really hot, smoky days. I remember that week. By the end of that week, when I met her, the air was just getting thicker and smokier by the day. And Briseida, when I called her a couple of days later, she said her head was hurting. Certainly in the area, the sun was barely, how can I put it? The sun struggled to break through the smoke in the sky. It looked to me like this sort of weird glowing orb in the sky. There was ash raining down, and throughout these days, workers like Briseida were in the fields.
So, Minnie, can I say something that made me think about the story? Um, in a lot of the conversations that we have on the sustainable agriculture, alternative food system is that there's a lot of erasure of farm workers. Like we don't think about farm workers because I quote they're a byproduct of the capitalist food system. So I don't know when I thought of that and someone that was harvesting decorations for the Thanksgiving table. And when I think of the rise of agritourism and people actually going to the farms to pick up their products and bypassing not so much farm workers and farm hands, but bypassing a lot of maybe those supply chains or nursery chains or traditional food supply chains that will bring you the harvest decorations for your Thanksgiving table. Just makes me think what does a future look like where we are so aware that that's the sacrifice and that's the labor that someone is putting in just for a simple decoration. It's not even for food. It's not even for fuel or for feed.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I just thinking about that because that's something that I talk a lot about. How we, especially in the sustainable agriculture movement, we don't talk about farm workers enough.
Mm-hmm.
We only think as part of the capitalist food production, usually more in agribusiness and in other industries. So,
Well, certainly what I saw in California, which is almost all large agricultural companies, there was just a lot of overproduction of food, and as you know, there's much more food grown in this country than is consumed, and there's just so much waste.
Vanessa, you have written about agriculture as a pathway of opportunity for many generations of new Americans, and I really love the sound of that. Can you tell us more?
so first and foremost, I always like to approach this putting my own privilege on the table. Like I'm an immigrant and I work in food and agricultural policy and I'm a documented immigrant. When I look about a lot that privilege, I think about so many people who are also immigrants, who are also Latinx, who also work in the food and agriculture industry in many different ways as farm workers or in the food service, and I have a lot of privilege on that realm. Um, so I always think about we have a national crisis at hand, and that one is that in the future we're gonna have less farmers because so many of our farmers are gonna be retiring, and we need to remember most of our current farmers are white and male and older, and we need to remember that 96% of the land in the United States is owned by white farmers, and around 40% of those are going to be retiring in the next 5-10 years. So well, this is what we usually call as the great transition. Like in the next decade we're going to see a huge transition of land, and that land can either go to people who have been marginalized out of agriculture for many years, like Native Americans and African American farmers. It can go to the next generation of farmers, young farmers, but it can also go to farm workers and former farmers, usually from other countries like Mexico and South America and all over the world, who are in this country as new Americans. And I feel that's like a tap of potential that we don't always realize when we think about the future of agriculture. And that goes back just to the hierarchy that happens in the farms with farm workers. We usually see farm workers as laborers, as input in the production in the system, and we don't see them as people who have skills and a knowledge and life experiences that will be so beneficial as we move and transition agricultural land in the coming years. And we don't even think of as farm workers as farmers, and I think that's also part of the problem. And again, it goes back to the hierarchy that it gets assigned at the farm based on status, gender, language access, and so much more. So I think that's something that when I think about the future of agriculture in this country and I think about what things we could be doing more of or better of, I think we should be investing more in transitioning farm workers as farmers. And there are many great programs that are really doing this. And also, we just should be transitioning more immigrants and refugees that come from agrarian backgrounds into agriculture because they really have so much knowledge and so much skills that we should be tapping into them so they can also become the future farmers of tomorrow.
Speaking of transitioning, farm work is increasingly being mechanized. So, do you see traditional farm work as we know it being phased out eventually?
Definitely. Actually, I would like to hear from Reyna if she's seeing a lot of like displacement due to that. Because what we know, at least from what I know, is like most of farm workers work in fruits and vegetables and nurseries. So those are things that we still have not commodified for harvesting and automatication, as we got done for grains and other things like corn and wheat.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something we've definitely seen throughout the years. And here's a little history lesson about Bitcoin. I mean, we really started back in 1985 with this Si Se Puede desire to want to have our own union, right? To have collective bargaining rights, to be able to unionize. And for many years, we had something called hiring hall, where members of Pekun would actually be in a contract with farms that wanted to do better, that were paying a pretty good wage. They were doing better than other farms in the past. And unfortunately, throughout the years, those contracts have slowly diminished because back in those times, early 90s, end of 90s, even early 2000s, we were being asked for hundreds of workers to go out and do work in these farms, to today where we're only being asked to send maybe 5 workers because of mechanization and because machines are doing some of the harvesting now. I think that that's something that we really need to look out for. And it's unfortunate too that it happened with some of the farms that actually were trying to do it in a way that was different than the status quo. We're also seeing kind of a shift in different harvests now too, especially in the Mid Willamette Valley. A lot of what we're seeing is that we used to have cucumbers here. Some of that has been now, we're getting a lot of our cucumbers from overseas, other countries, and a lot of it's transitioned into hemp. But mechanization, I think, is something that more people need to talk about. I also love that you brought up the conversation about this massive transition of land that's going to be happening, agricultural land. How are we as a community really going to be coming together to figure out how we can take this opportunity to really turn those farm workers to farmers? I mean, we ourselves come from generations of farmers back in, at least for myself, I'll speak for me, of indigenous people from Michoacan, people who farmed the land, who had a special relationship that now that really has been lost in my generation, at least, that didn't get to learn those things, but are really got caught up in the exploitative practices that we have today in our agricultural sector. But I think that if we could really reimagine or actually be more intentional about what that transition looks like, we could actually have something that is community owned, that has really brings a different kind of value to our farm workers, which shifts them into farmers and brings in this indigenous also knowledge of how to care for the land, which is so needed right now, because all of this is not living in a bubble, right? We're very actively talking about these wildfires, for example, being very connected to climate change. And how are we going to be bringing stakeholders into this conversation, where in the short term we're talking about policies that protect workers, but in the long term we're really talking about making massive shifts that address the climate change issue?
Reyna, what a great segue into our next topic. Let's take a quick break right now and hear from our sponsor, and we'll get right back to the conversation. And we are so lucky to have a compassionate company, Laughing Planet, returning once again as a sponsor this month. Laughing Planet is a restaurant with multiple locations in the Portland area that offers global flavors at an affordable price. Laughing Planet believes that a happy planet requires responsible decisions from plant to plate, so they source ingredients from local farmers and use recyclable and compostable materials. And they help out our community in more ways than one. During this COVID pandemic, Laughing Planet has been offering free kids' meals to students who otherwise rely on meal assistance programs at schools. You can get Laughing Planet delivered to your door or pick up at any location. Order over the phone, through DoorDash, or online. And if you want that 20% discount, use our promo code 4TOP at checkout. That's right, just enter FOURTOP as your promo code, and you will get 20% off your order. Give it a try, folks, and you'll be getting healthy, locally sourced food for cheap and supporting the 4TOP. And now, back to the show. This episode is slated to go live the day before Election Day, so let's turn our focus from problems to potential solutions. Vanessa García Polenco, you are a federal policy associate with the National Young Farmers Coalition. As we look to the next 4 years, what makes you hopeful? What sorts of policies would you like to see enacted regarding agricultural labor?
Definitely. First, I would like to say that the National Young Farmers Coalition, we position ourselves as an ally to the rest of the farm worker organizations that we work with. We never try to say what is best for the farm worker organizations. We always rely on their counsel and their advice because we're allies on this space. So we definitely we only put forward, endorse, and recommend things that our allies like Reyna and other people in the ground and farm worker-led organizations are endorsing already. But we definitely would like to see. We need to imagine a better future. We need to imagine the impossible, and I think that's what I'm sticking to these days. Right now, there's great legislation there's about to be introduced in the Senate that will be restorative justice for Black farmers, for African American farmers. Is if we can do legislation like that, that can also help us imagine a future for farm workers. Can also maybe create a transition program for farm workers to transition to farm ownership. We need to imagine that. We need to push ourselves to imagine radical, progressive proposals that will really transform our food system. But right now, if we cannot do that, we just need to ask for the bare minimum, and that's dignity and safety. It's just doing the bare minimum for essential workers because, as so many of you have stressed already, they are the ones taking most of the burden. And also, we need to recognize they have been left out. So we did stimulus bills. We had done many incentives to farmers, many subsidies for farmers. We need to recognize that farm workers are still having left out, or almost all packages of relief that are related to the coronavirus pandemic. So package and bills or future legislation should honor the essential role that they play, not just during the pandemic, but beyond the pandemic, and the role that they play as future farmers and the role that they play in keeping us fed. Remember, immigrants feed us, and we just need to be more. We just need to put that more front and center in our conversations. Like we eat the way that we eat because of immigrants in the food supply chain in this country.
Well, I want to follow up with a question to all of you. How can we as individuals take action to see some of this legislation passed, to see some protections passed for these essential workers who are really feeding us and keeping us alive to their own threat?
I think that that one of the most important things that we need to do is we need mass legalization of the agricultural workforce. We have not had a legalization since 1986, and that was actually when my parents were able to get their papers, and it really changed the trajectory of our lives. We almost were able to get a comprehensive package in 2013, and also that didn't happen. And now I think that really a lot of folks are depending on this election going towards Biden so that we can actually try to get something done. But I think that many of the things that we're seeing, people falling through the cracks of stimulus, people not being able to access healthcare, people not being able to have the basic protections because we've basically created this second class of people through the immigration system that we have. And time again, that's still the number one issue that we're hearing from agricultural workers all across, not just Oregon, but all across the country. I also think that people need to understand that still today, agricultural workers do not have collective bargaining protections under the National Labor Relations Act. And we are still struggling to have that. I know that New York got a chance to pass something in the past year. California's had their law for a while, but we still don't have it in Oregon, even after the struggle for many decades to have more protections for our workers. And that's something that we're still fighting for. Farm worker overtime. A lot of folks don't know that this is also something that farm workers do not have a legal protection of, and we are also looking into seeing what our options are to make sure that if workers are going to be out there 60 hours a week, right, that they do deserve some kind of overtime pay. In addition to really holding our agencies' feet to the fire, OSHA is definitely one of those agencies that needs to step up, needs to create a standard for protections for workers, needs to ensure that it is centering workers when it's making rules and regulations that have to do with a variety of sectors, but specifically low wage immigrant workers. And there's several things that we're looking into, but especially during the COVID pandemic, we're looking into what OSHA needs to do to step up on field sanitation, farm labor housing, and in farm labor transportation. So these are just some examples, but I also really believe that there must be a mass mobilization of resources when it comes to really addressing climate change, environmental justice. Agricultural workers need to be front and center in that conversation because we know that our agricultural practices are going to be essential in how we look into the future, into the green economy of the future, and making sure that we do it differently, hopefully very soon.
Just to add to that, if I might just add that certainly climate change impacts agriculture in a huge way. hotter days, hotter nights has a direct bearing on food production. At the same time, the way we produce food also has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions and, in turn, climate change. On the eve of the presidential elections, one of the most stark differences between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, of course, is where they stand on climate change and what they intend to do about it. Donald Trump denies climate science. Joe Biden has a very ambitious package of proposals to address climate change. And one thing that I've certainly learned in the course of my reporting is farm workers are among those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And that's where we, started this conversation, is the how farm workers feel it sometimes most acutely because they're exposed to the heat and the wildfire smoke every day when they go to work.
So maybe we'll just lead out with a little dessert course in which we each share something that we've been enjoying this week. It could be anything related to food and beverage. And Somini, in honor of you, I wanted to just recommend to everyone who doesn't already have it to get the New York Times cooking app, because it is something pleasurable to browse after reading the very depressing news every day. Lately, I've just been loving Kalu Henry and Tejal Rao's recipes. And I knew Kalu here in Oregon many years ago, so it's really fun to see her recipes there. Does anyone else have a little dessert item to finish out the show?
I don't have a dessert item, but I do have, after this, I am going to be eating some homemade menudo that my mother is making me. So really excited to eat that. Right now, the aroma that is filling the room that I'm in, it's homey, it's hominy, it's, it smells like home. So I'm really excited to eat that. And it's not dessert, but for me, I'm more of a savory person anyway. So,
I bet that smells amazing. Vanessa, do you have a little dessert item for us?
Yeah, I just finished watching Gather, a new documentary about Native American food waste in farming.
Oh, wonderful.
Especially as we were just talking about the importance of using traditional knowledge to fight climate change and to honor the knowledge and skills so many farm workers bring to this country. It was a beautiful documentary, so everyone please go watch it. It's really good.
And where can we find that?
I watched it with a collective, a Native American collective, but it's widely available. So just Google it. Sorry.
Okay, we'll Google it. And we'll throw it up on our social media as well. Somini, do you have a little dessert item to leave us with?
In the last 7 months of pandemic and lockdown, one of the things that I think a lot of us have learned is how to plan our meals and how to feed our families. And one thing that I've certainly got much better at, and I think many of us have, is just how to make, how can I put this? How to waste less and really stretch out what we have, and make sure that as little as possible goes into the landfill. That has certainly been a real lesson for me in the last 7 or 8 months. I've enjoyed cooking that way and learning how to just throw away virtually nothing.
Mm-hmm. Stem to root cooking. I love it. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. This has been a fascinating episode. I wish we could just keep speaking all evening, but it's getting late, and I know that everyone needs to get on with their lives and eat their delicious dinners. Thank you, Vanessa García Polenco, a researcher, writer, and activist focusing on food, agriculture, and sustainability, and Reyna Lopez, executive director at PECUN, Oregon's Farm Worker Union, and Somini Sengupta, an author and international climate reporter for the New York Times. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Katherine Cole here in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in my bedroom. I really appreciate you all joining us, and I really appreciate everyone who listened today. Thanks.
This episode of The Foretop was recorded in remote locations all over the United States. Katherine Cole is our host and executive producer. Izzy Kramer is our producer. I'm Keelan King, editor and audio technician. You can check out our website, thefordtop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, donate to the show, and reach out to us on social media. And if you have not already subscribed to The Four Top on iTunes, NPR One, or Spotify, please do so and leave us a rating. Stay safe out there.
Well, now that episode is over, you're probably wondering what to listen to next. Let me tell you about Spilled Milk. It's a comedy show about food hosted by award-winning writers Molly Weisenberg and Matthew Amster Burton. Every week, they start with a food-related topic, from shrimp cocktail to barbecue sauce to ice cream sandwiches, but they probably end up talking about their love of Cool Ranch Doritos or debating who was the most bleepable character on Friday Night Lights. The New York Times recently named Spilled Milk one of the 6 podcasts to feed your inner gourmand and described the show as less deliberately educational than other food podcasts. On a personal note, I want to add that I really enjoyed Molly Weisenberg's recent book. It's called The Fixed Stars. And, we were lucky enough to have Molly and Matthew on the Four Top on episode 36, which was recorded live at PodCon. So check out that episode at thefourtop.org and you can give it a listen. New episodes of Spilled Milk air every Thursday. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks, Spilled Milk, for partnering with The Four Top.